So I'm getting a bunch of things ready for this episode, and it takes me a little longer, as you guys can tell by the start time, to get things in order and then to come on here. But it was very well worth it, because I just realized and appreciated in making these edits for you all and in doing my prep work, I realized how insane the 12-team college football playoff is. And I mean this in a good way, in a bad way as well. Just one game can change almost all the seedings in the bracket entirely, outside, of course, the top four, because those are locked in via conference championship game winners, conference champions, the top four. So that actually does provide some stability, the conference auto bids, but my opinion on that is still the same. Just let the best 12 teams or the best 14 or best 16 teams in. Don't do any of this auto bid nonsense. Don't do any of the buy nonsense, and just have the top half of the teams, give them home field advantage. And your problems are solved. That gives us more games on campus, more college football feeling environments, and the top seeds are still going to have a significant advantage over most other seeds, whether they have buys or not. But that's just my opinion, and yes, we are going to be talking about my updated college football playoff bracket post week 0. We'll also discuss Michigan versus Fresno State, Ohio State against Akron, and Miami versus Florida. Two games where you're really looking at Michigan and Ohio State and seeing what they can do against these opponents to help Michigan prepare for Texas in week 2, and to help Ohio State prepare for Oregon on the road in week 7. Ohio State has more time than Michigan to get things warmed up. It's been the opposite in other years, but really these two teams this weekend, although Fresno State could do something against Michigan, it's more of when they will win rather than if. The only ifs about these teams are, is Ohio State's offensive line and their running room, are they good? Are they serviceable? Can they produce an elite rushing attack? Because if they can, if they have a great O-line, and if their rushing offense is among the nation's best, then they will be national champions or national runner-ups. And for Michigan, it's, how does the quarterback situation look? Who at wide receiver steps up? Because if Michigan has a competent passing attack, a good, great passing attack, along with what they have on defense and should have at running back in the offensive line, they're once again a national championship contender after winning it all last season. Miami against Florida is obviously going to be a competitive game. At some point, I think I believed that it would be rather lopsided, but here we are. Opinions change when you do more research. Before we kick this off, please hit that like button. Hit the subscribe button. Just give it a click, and also click the notification bell beside it. Share this video around so that we can grow this community, this awesome community that is College Football with Sam, to 20,000 subscribers on YouTube, where you have the chance to receive a gift from me. I'll be doing a giveaway at 20,000 subscribers. And our first video to reach 1,000 likes on this channel, I'll also be doing a giveaway to celebrate that. I'll be doing a giveaway to celebrate our first video that gets over 1,000 likes on YouTube. So there are two giveaways that I anticipate we will have in this 2024 season that I expect us to have that will be awaiting you. And if you're subscribed, if you comment often, and especially if you hit the notification bell, your chances of getting those gifts and also receiving awesome content and analysis on the world of college football exponentially increase. So just do those things to help out the channel. It is really just that simple. Thank you so much for doing those things and also for tuning in. We have Armand Hammer on here, a longtime fan of the show who is in ACC country in the Carolinas. We have Zachary Appleberry. I do not know exactly where he is from, but thank you for tuning in. And of course, as always, I will answer super chats at the end of the stream. Thank you all for your support, and let's kick it off and talk about some games here. First and foremost, Miami versus Florida is a historied, or that sounds weird. Miami versus Florida is a historic college football rivalry. A rivalry that is not as played as often as it once was, but these teams met in 2019 and played a competitive game, despite the fact that Miami did not even finish the season ranked. I think they were barely above 500, maybe finished just below 500. I forget if they were 6-7 or 7-6 that year. And Florida finished with an 11-2 record, an Orange Bowl victory. And that was also a Week 1 game where Miami was the more sluggish team and Florida was more disciplined, and consequentially, they came out on top. Miami profiles to be the much better team per analysts, per studying the roster, looking at returning production and how these teams have done in the transfer portal, how they have done in the recruiting world, and also what they've achieved over the past 2 seasons, though that isn't saying much because Miami went 5-7 and then 7-6 in 2022 and 2023, and Florida went 6-7 and 5-7 in 2022 and 2023. They have been both underachieving programs, and therefore I would say this is a must-win for both teams. Miami has the much easier schedule. Florida has the toughest schedule in the country. I think Miami has a pretty soft schedule. But a loss for Miami here is very humiliating. It just is, because you're losing to essentially the worst of the Power 4 Florida teams right now in terms of on-the-field results and in terms of win total expectations and in terms of the fact that Billy Napier, many believe that he will no longer have a job after this season, including myself, I got to be honest, because even if Florida wins this game with the schedule that the Gators have and the fact that Miami could be a middle-of-the-road team in general or just on Florida's schedule, they could be one of Florida's easier games, factoring that they have home field advantage against the Hurricanes, Billy Napier and the Gators do, and whether it's Georgia, Texas, Ole Miss, LSU, Florida State if they get their act together, and then Texas A&M, Tennessee. I'm naming opponents left and right who will probably be ranked top 25 to end the season, and you know that Georgia, Texas, Ole Miss, and potentially LSU and Texas A&M are top 10 teams. Miami could also be a top 10 team this year. The schedule's a gauntlet, so while I think Florida needs this game more because of that, Miami also needs this game. It'll help with recruiting. It'll help get their year off right, give them a hot start. And it's one of those games on their schedule that is losable. Miami does not have, in theory, many losable games. This is one of them. And I think it would help give Mario Cristobal and the team a bit of juice. And I think would help Cristobal and maybe even that staff and locker room a bit. Maybe I'm largely speculating here. But when Miami has lost in 2022 and 2023 in humiliating fashion, whether it was Middle Tennessee State in 2022 or Georgia Tech in 2023, they imploded afterward. And Middle Tennessee State was a bad team. Georgia Tech last year was a below average, mediocre team. Florida will likely end the year as a team with a mediocre or bad win-loss record. They'll probably be a average to above average Power 4 team. So I think that it would be very appreciated by the Miami fan base and by the whole team and staff if they can win this game. Even if Florida finishes 4-8, 5-7, 6-6, 7-5, or 8-4, doesn't matter. It's a rivalry game as well. So add that on top of the fact that Miami is coaching and playing for their reputation. Florida is coaching and playing just to survive and advance. This is a rivalry game. So it will probably be close. And in close games, Miami's favored by 2.5. 2.5. It says 10 up there. I have no reason why. But in close games, you often look at who's the better team on special teams, who's the least penalized team, who has less turnovers, just who has more discipline. And both teams last year were very undisciplined. They were both outside of the top 75 in penalties per game. They averaged greater than 6 penalties per game in 2023, which is a pretty jarring number. Teams like Minnesota and Michigan averaged far less penalties per game last year. Minnesota was a 5-7 team, and Michigan was a 12-0 team in the regular season. So penalties are just a smaller portion of the game. Washington was very highly penalized, and they went 14-1. But in close games, typically penalties, turnovers, special teams, and running the football and stopping the run, which help in game control, clock management, those things decide the winner. And both of these teams have been horrific. We don't even need to go further than that. They have been horrific at game management, at discipline, at playing to their talent level. Teams like Iowa, Michigan, Florida State, I would argue even, I'm trying to think, Missouri. Missouri's the classic SEC program of the past year. And I'd even say Tennessee under Heupel that is punched above its weight class. Oh, not going to forget about you, Auburn. Florida and Miami have not done any of that. NC State in the ACC is punched above its weight class. And Florida and Miami are sitting with top 15 talent rosters. Florida used to have a top 10 talent roster. Miami is trying to get to a top 10 talent roster, and they underachieve year over year over year. It's been that way for Miami ever since a few seasons before Larry Coker got fired, outside of maybe 2017, and that ended on a bad note despite an ACC championship game appearance. And Florida, outside of a few good years under Dan Mullen, has been underachieving ever since Urban Meyer's last season. So these teams don't have a reputation for discipline, for good special teams, for clock management, for just being good teams, period, amen. And I think that this will be Florida's best team under Billy Napier. It'll also be Miami's best team, I'd say by a mile, under Mario Cristobal. So I think compared to like 2019, theoretically and by power rankings, this would be a closer game. And when you look at how these teams would have matched up last year, probably would have played one of the ugliest games imaginable. I think there will be good football in this game, despite the reputation of both of these staffs and rosters. But there are still questions with Mario Cristobal and Billy Napier, and the reason I'm mainly looking at penalties is because Miami is better at, quite frankly, every position, or at least the same as Florida is. They have the more talented roster. They have the better players. Graham Mertz is a respectable quarterback for Florida. Montrell Johnson Jr., I don't know if he's going to play this Saturday. It doesn't sound like it. But they have a good offensive line to help open up the run game with Jake Slaughter at center. They have, I'd actually say, respectable special teams with Trey Smack at kicker and also Jeremy Crawshaw, one of the best punters in the nation, at that position. Graham Mertz threw for nearly 3,000 yards last year and completed 73% of his passes, 20 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, averaged 8.1 yards per pass. Ricky Pearsall is gone, but Eugene Wilson III is back. And they have a decent stable of wide receivers, and also tight end Arliss Boardingham is back as well, who had 4 receiving touchdowns and nearly 300 yards as a tight end last year. So Mertz does have some weapons, even without his top 2 backs from last season. And with Miami, a player I'd pay attention to for them is Damian Martinez, who had 1,185 rushing yards, 9 rushing touchdowns, averaged 6.1 yards per carry on the ground. Just an overall great player. He will be supported by an offensive line that features Inez Cooper, features Zach Carpenter, features Jalen Rivers, Francis Mauigoa, could be one of the best O-lines in the country. Cameron Ward, I think, will be a top 25 quarterback this season. He was outside the top 50 in QBR last season, and he did have a few problems with playing a little loose and having some turnovers, throwing 7 picks to only 25 touchdowns last year. But he threw for 3,735 yards, played in an air raid system, and 11 even better air raid system here with the Hurricanes. And then on the defensive line, Simeon Barrow Jr., Tyler Barron, Ruben Bain Jr., and a good kicker in Andreas Borealis means that Miami has a good defense and, like Florida, good special teams. I'm picking Miami to win, to cover the 2.5-point spread, win 27-17, and the reason for that is Miami is the better offense, the better defense. I'd say the vastly better defense. And by the end of the year, I think I'll have the vastly better offense. Right now, though, with some transfers, new quarterback, the system and personnel will be adapted to the depth chart. And the fact that the swamp is going to be loud when Miami's offense is on the field makes me think that they're not going to light up Florida, but they'll win, and I think they will comfortably cover this spread. It will be close for much of the game, but I think eventually Miami will pull through. Their defense will show out as superior to Florida's, and you'll get that 27-17 type game where it's not clean. It's also not super high scoring or super low scoring. It's in the middle of everything. A little bit of dirt and also a little bit of soap on the cleanliness scale, whatever you want to call that, and also a little bit of firepower mixed with a little bit of rock slinging. So I'm taking Miami to cover the 2.5-point spread, win 27-17. Maybe they score more and win by 2 touchdowns or 2 touchdowns and a field goal. Maybe Florida brings it to overtime. I have a hard time seeing Florida win. I know that they can. I just have a hard time processing that because Miami has the better quarterback, better running back. If Montrell Johnson was healthy, fully healthy for this game, I'd say you could make an argument that Florida has the better running back room. But he's uncertain. Doesn't sound like he's going to play. Miami has the better receivers, the better offensive line, better defense. Special teams is about a push, but when you have that type of roster advantage that Miami has, I think that they will overcome that if Florida ends up having the better special teams unit. Okay, so we're going to be moving on here now and discussing my playoff bracket. Now, after week 0, obviously, Florida State was upset by Georgia Tech. So here we go. Post week 0 playoff predictions. Isn't this so beautiful? Only 4 games were played in week 0, and my playoff bracket has already changed because I had Florida State winning the ACC, going undefeated 13-0. You can laugh all you want. It's totally fine. It's actually pretty funny in hindsight. And therefore, a 13-0 Florida State I thought would lock up the number 3 seed because I had Utah, the 4 seed, Big 12 champion, going 12-1. But now, things have changed, obviously. And with Florida State looking the way they did in Ireland against Georgia Tech, I cannot pick them to win the ACC when Miami and Clemson exist. And don't forget about Virginia Tech or Georgia Tech, who's undefeated in ACC and regular season conference play combined. So there are changes that have been made. And consequentially, because Florida State, I not only have them losing to Miami in the regular season, but I also now have them losing to Notre Dame, who I previously picked them to beat on the road in November in what was going to be, in my mind, a close game. Now it could be a Notre Dame blowout. That really messed up the entire bracket. It just, like the hand motions I did, it shuffled everything around. Notre Dame I have at 12-0 for context, and I don't think that they would make the 5 or 6 seed, as I have number 5 Alabama and number 6 Penn State reaching their conference title games with undefeated records and receiving close losses. Both would play, consequentially, by playing in a conference championship game against Ohio State and Georgia, have tougher strength of schedules than Notre Dame would, and with only 1 loss and the same amount of wins, I think they would be seeded ahead of Notre Dame, who now I think is a true cupcake schedule, because I don't think that USC or Florida State or anyone on their schedule except for maybe Georgia Tech, but more likely than Georgia Tech, as I think they're around that USC and Florida State tier. A&M's really their only, I would say, extremely challenging game from a roster and paper standpoint. But College football's played on the field, not on paper. So let me run through this very quickly. I have Liberty still 13-0, Conference USA champions at the 12th seed. I have Iowa 11-1 as the 11th seed, only losing to Ohio State on the road. I have at the 10th seed the Oregon Ducks, losing at home to Ohio State and Michigan on the road. And at 9th, I have the Missouri Tigers, losing only to Alabama on the road, earning key wins, though, against Texas A&M, for example, and Oklahoma. I have at the 8th seed the Michigan Wolverines. Michigan I have going 11-1, beating Texas and Oregon, but losing to Ohio State to close out the season. I have at 7th a 12-0 undefeated Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Their biggest win will be on the road at Texas A&M, and that'll be about it. They beat USC, Florida State, and everyone else on their schedule, but not a very tough strength of schedule, especially compared to number 6 Penn State, who I have going 12-1, beating West Virginia, beating USC, beating Wisconsin, even beating Ohio State at home for the first time since 2016, but losing to the Buckeyes in a rematch in the Big Ten Championship. Therefore, Penn State gets the 6th seed. Ohio State with a 12-1 record, losing to Penn State in the regular season, but beating Oregon, beating Michigan, beating Penn State in the rematch in Indy. They get the 2 seed as they're the Big Ten champions. For the 5 seed, I have the Alabama Crimson Tide. I have them going undefeated in the regular season like Penn State. That means they beat Georgia at home. That means they beat Missouri at home. They will beat LSU and Auburn and Tennessee, Wisconsin on the road. They have a gargantuan schedule, very hard schedule. I have them at 12-1. Their only loss will come to Georgia in the SEC championship game rematch. Consequently, Georgia, who I have going 11-1 in the regular season, only losing to Alabama on the road, but beating Texas and Ole Miss on the road. They, with a win over Alabama to earn a 12-1 record and an SEC championship game win, they'll get the number 1 seed, as they will be the SEC champions. At the 4 seed, I have the Utah Utes, who will go 12-1. Their sole loss coming to Iowa State. They'll beat Kansas in the Big 12 championship game and enter as the 4th seed with a 12-1 record. The 3 seed will be the Miami Hurricanes. I have them going 12-1, losing actually to Georgia Tech in the regular season again, but that's because Georgia Tech is much better than they were last year, and they get a bye before and after the Miami game, so they can go all in and not be afraid of having a letdown game afterward. I think that's a huge advantage for Georgia Tech, and I think Miami, in beating Florida, in beating Florida State, and beating Louisville, Virginia Tech, I think they're bound to mess up somewhere just because there are some holes on their roster, and I don't think that Mario Cristobal, I don't think he's capable of going 12-0. I'll have to see it to believe it with Miami, but I have them going 12-1, winning the ACC championship for now, actually, in a rematch with Georgia Tech, and you'll see why that is in tomorrow's video about my final conference record predictions, post week 0, of course. But at 12-1 ACC champions, I have them ranked number 3 in the college football playoff seeding. So those are the matchups, and I have Michigan beating Missouri. I have Oregon earning a road win over Notre Dame. I have Penn State and Alabama blowing out Iowa and Liberty, respectively. Now let's move on and talk about the semifinals. I have in the quarterfinals Georgia beating Michigan. I think that Michigan and Georgia are similarly built. If Michigan wanted a shot at beating or even dominating Georgia, it was last year when they had a great elite college quarterback and great wide receivers. Now with all of that gone and being a thinner team and Georgia returning as much as they do entering this season, Georgia is Michigan's nightmare matchup. They're not getting past Georgia. Alabama will beat Utah, and consequently the Alabama-Georgia game, I think, will be a semifinal matchup. So they'll meet 3 times in the same season, which will be a record, and it will be, I think, kind of awesome and incredible. There'd be a lot of build-up to that game. Utah would play Alabama more competitively, at least in terms of final score. And I actually think in actuality on the field that Michigan would play Georgia. I think a Kyle Whittingham type team who's deep in the trenches against an Alabama team who will be a lot of finesse, and they'll be deep in the trenches too, but not as deep as past Saban teams. I think that's a good matchup for Utah. Alabama will overcome all of that, but Utah will play them competitively. I have Oregon beating Ohio State. Ohio State beats them in the regular season. It's hard to beat a good team twice, and I think out of all the Big Ten teams, the top four specifically, Oregon, Penn State, Michigan, and Ohio State, Oregon, I think, is the best built to play in a playoff setting because of their, I would say, lack of questions at every position except for safety. And if you're going to have questions anywhere, and I don't even think safety's bad for Oregon, I just think it's whether they're average, above average, good, or great there. You'd rather have questions there than at quarterback in the O-line, and that's where Ohio State has their questions. And I think consequentially, from my perspective, Ohio State may actually be the worst built out of those four to go into the college football playoff and to reach the national championship. Controversial opinion of mine, I know. And if Ohio State puts together a great offensive line, then that opinion totally falls apart. They'd immediately be the best built because of their wide receivers and the depth and weapons they have basically everywhere else. But I think Oregon, just losing to Ohio State early on, again, it's hard to beat a good team twice. They have the better quarterback, wide receivers, superior offensive line, and they're going to be a very fast team, and they can also slow things down. Ohio State, honestly, first time back, winning the Big Ten. This would be the Rose Bowl matchup, Ohio State versus Oregon, which would give it a kind of classic feel. I just think that Ohio State comes into Outson early in the season, is able to just use that advantage that they have in, I would say, the secondary and the wide receiver core. Ohio State's DBs would be able to limit Oregon's wide receivers. I can't say the same thing about Oregon's wide receivers versus Ohio State's wide receivers, or Oregon's DBs, versus Ohio State's wide receivers. But later in the season, I think that Will Howard, the receivers he has, the limited depth on the offensive line that they have, I think that plus the fact that Oregon, with all the transfers they have on defense, should get better at that spot as the year goes on. And Dylan Gabriel's a really good quarterback. I just think that gives an edge to Oregon there. Another game, which there's a lot of analysis to dive in on, is Penn State versus Miami. And that is because, let's just face it, neither James Franklin or Mario Cristobal are known to be great game managers, but they have great offensive coordinators now. Andy Kotelnicki, I think is the best offensive coordinator in all of college football. And Shannon Dawson could be up there, depending on what Miami does this season. Both have highly talented quarterbacks. Cameron Ward for the Hurricanes, Drew Aller for the Nittany Lions, who have been inconsistent and have their obvious strengths, their obvious potential, but also some very glaring weaknesses. I think both will take big steps forward this year, by the way, but they have questions nonetheless. They're a little bit different at receiver. Penn State is very deep and talented at tight end. Miami's that same way at wide receiver, and they have questions in the other position. Penn State has big questions at wide receiver. Miami has some questions at tight end. They both have deep running back rooms. Damian Martinez, I think, is the best back out of their rooms combined. But then right behind him, you got Katron Allen and Nicholas Singleton. And Quinyon Martin is a young player who I think could see some time for Penn State this year. A.J. Allen. And there's another back for Miami who's, I don't like to forget names here, so I'm just going to look. Mark Fletcher Jr. is in there as well with A.J. Allen and Damian Martinez for the Hurricanes. Both have deep, deep running back rooms. Their offensive lines are losing some players each, but Miami should be one of the best of the best. Penn State, with how they've recruited, has that ceiling. I wouldn't project them to be that way now, but certainly I would say a top 15, potentially top 10 offensive line. I'm picking the Nittany Lions to win here because I think that they are, I honestly think that they have the better coordinators. I think they have the better assistant coaches. And James Franklin does get a lot of criticism, and he should. He rightfully does. Same with Mario Cristobal. But I will say that given the fact that I believe Penn State's roster is more NFL ready, and I actually think that James Franklin is a better coach than Mario Cristobal, I think those two things combined, along with the fact that, look, hard schedules will hurt teams a lot because it will wear down on depth. It can earn them extra losses compared to an easy schedule. But an easy schedule does not prepare you for facing the elite teams. Penn State has enough of a balanced schedule to where it's easy outside of their matchup against Ohio State, maybe medium toughness against West Virginia, USC, and Wisconsin, but it's not going to be super challenging on paper. Again, big asterisk there, on paper outside of that Ohio State game, and if they rematch with Ohio State, that second game against Ohio State. They have a little bit of toughness in their schedule, and they'll play a plethora of good defenses like Wisconsin, and they'll play Ohio State, who could have the nation's best defense this season. With Miami, they don't necessarily play that same schedule. It's actually, in my mind, easier than Penn State's. The Big Ten is a different animal than the ACC. That's just a small reason, but a reason nonetheless that I want to mention. Combine that with the fact that I think Penn State has a much better defensive line. They're much better on defense in every position. Defensive line, linebacker, secondary, similar special teams. Offensively, I would say Miami's better, but not to the same degree that Penn State is on defense. And they have the better offensive coordinator. I think that Penn State will slowly but surely, in a game like that, I think that game, I forget if it would be the Peach Bowl. I think it would be the Peach Bowl is what I'm projecting it to be, yes. Penn State would outpace Miami in terms of being able to slow down or speed up the clock, and they'd outcoach them too and move on to the semifinals. The semifinal results, I have Oregon beating Penn State and Georgia beating Alabama. At this point, you can't dive in too deep. I mean, I even struggled to dive in deep for any of these matchups. But the reason I'm picking Georgia to beat Alabama is I think Georgia's the much deeper team. They have the better coaching staff, better head coach. They're the more balanced roster. So I think third time around, these teams both know each other, and therefore I think the best team will win, and that's Georgia. Oregon versus Penn State. I actually think Penn State's the slightly better team than Oregon per my personal power rankings. I wouldn't be surprised if my computerized power rankings, which will be releasing soon, think the same way, but I could easily see them viewing Oregon to be better. But Oregon, I think, how do I put it? It's similar reasons for why they're beating Ohio State. Like, I wouldn't pick Michigan, Penn State. I wouldn't pick anyone in the Big Ten to beat Oregon on a neutral field in a playoff environment. I just wouldn't. And it's especially the case with Penn State over Oregon. I could see Ohio State beating Oregon or Michigan beating Oregon more easily than I could Penn State over Oregon. And the reason for that is Penn State is not strong enough at either wide receiver or the O-line. Michigan and Ohio State both have one of an elite O-line or a near elite O-line or elite, near elite wide receiver room. Penn State's offensive line doesn't have that reputation yet. Their receiving room, I think, is one of the worst ones in the Big Ten, simply because I don't know how healthy Julian Fleming will be. And Oregon's weakness is safety. You need wide receivers and a quarterback who is dynamic. And I would say not just his arm talent, but with how talented Oregon is overall, his legs as well, to make that DB room and that defense overall pay. And I just don't think Penn State, with Aller, who isn't as dynamic of a scrambler as Howard or Orji are, who I think is a worse wide receiver room than both of those teams, a worse O-line than Michigan, a better O-line than Ohio State, but also a worse defense than those teams. And Penn State, like Oregon's already playing several playoff games in a row, so depth begins to show, and I think Oregon is similar depth, probably deeper in terms, definitely deeper in terms of talent. I think at a position like quarterback, more consistent, wide receiver, they're deeper, they're deeper on the offensive line, much more experience there. I think Oregon will pull through. A Georgia versus Oregon game would be fascinating, but I think Georgia is closer to double digits better than everyone this year. As I've said earlier, I think it's Georgia's year to lose the national title. Consequently, it's also their year to win the national title. This is their year to lose. It's also their year to win. I think they're the number one team, and while it's not as distant as, let's say, it was in 2020 with Alabama and everyone else, it's a fairly distant year, I think, in terms of Georgia being at the top compared to everyone else. It'll be similar to Georgia in 2021 and how they were in Tier 1 and everyone else was either in, Tier 1B at the best and then not even in Georgia's room at the very worst. So that is my 2024 college football playoff bracket. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much. Comment your own playoff bracket in the comment section below. So, what do you think about this? What do you think about this now that I can turn off a little bit of my scripted self? What do you think here about my playoff bracket? I'm curious. I'll take a little bit of a break here and just read over the comments. Then we'll get to Fresno State versus Michigan and Ohio State versus Akron. What do you think? Armand Hammer says, Iowa over Ole Miss. I don't know. I had Ole Miss just missing out on the college football playoff at 10-2. Their schedule is very easy, like Iowa's, and I think Iowa with the extra win, but more importantly, an improved offense and an elite defense would have enough of an argument to actually get in over Ole Miss. Howdy do, Sam and everyone. Hey, Sam, going off last week's craziness, Akron upsets Ohio State. Welcome back, Chimichanga Guy. He has been a part of this channel for a long, long time. Great supporter, and I'm excited every time he pops on. Same with a lot of people on here. CK Cash 26. I love the work you do and detail you put in. The love of the game shows. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Now it's time to get back to talking about college football games in week 1. And also, before I go any further, I want to remind you all that my Discord server is going to go live sometime early next week, maybe earlier if I have the time. And I am in need of moderators. And yeah, in need of moderators, in need of people who want to be active, who have a lot of friends who are interested in college football. If you're interested in joining my Discord server as a moderator, email me at collegefootballwithsam@gmail.com. It's just that simple. I'll type in my email address in the comments section. Email me there. collegefootballwithsam@gmail.com. If you want to become a Discord moderator, a YouTube moderator as well, just so that we can make this community even better, so I can delegate responsibility like a head coach delegates to his assistants, and it'll make my life easier, your life easier, and make the channel that much better. But now, let's dive back in, and I want to talk about a variety of things when it comes to Michigan and Ohio State. Whether it's their offense, their defense, their running back room, quarterback room, receivers, secondary, you name it. These teams are undergoing significant changes. Michigan's undergoing more than Ohio State, but Ohio State's still undergoing changes. So let's kick it off with Fresno State at Michigan. The Michigan Wolverines, for the first time in school history, are playing the Fresno State Bulldogs. Michigan is favored by 21.5 points. And this is in Ann Arbor, in the Big House. And you can clearly see that Vegas is factoring in the fact that Michigan's only returning 40% of their production, that they have a new, very unproven quarterback, and that Fresno State returns Mikey Keene. I mean, that's what the pause was for, is Fresno State has a good quarterback. They don't have a bum. They don't have someone who was once good. but they have a good quarterback. Good as in now. Mikey Keene had 24 passing touchdowns, 10 interceptions, 2,976 passing yards last season. At UCF, in 2 seasons, he had 22 passing touchdowns, 7 interceptions, over 2,000 passing yards, and 1 rushing touchdown. And he's played behind good offensive lines at UCF and Fresno State and in good offensive systems. He only had last season a 76th placement in terms of QBR. He had a 56.6 QBR, but I would classify him as a good quarterback. You have to remember that being at Fresno State, his supporting cast is limited, and QBR does like teams that are good. They don't just really factor in the quarterback. You will notice that the best QBs are typically on the best teams in QBR, more than passer rating or more than any other metric. And that's typically the case in college football, but there are sometimes some exceptions to that. And Mikey Keene can certainly be that for Fresno State. Fresno State also has some challenging players at running back with Malik Sherrod. Malik Sherrod last year had 966 rushing yards, 9 rushing touchdowns, averaged 5.6 yards per carry on the ground. Magdalena, Jalen Moss, and Cheddon James are the projected starting wide receivers. Magdalena last year, he had 509 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns. Jalen Moss had 706 receiving yards and 6 receiving touchdowns. There are pieces on the offensive line who are back. All starters are going to be seniors except for right guard Campbell McHard. On defense, last season Fresno State had 30 sacks, 42 passes defended, 17 interceptions. Their leader in sacks last year was Jacob Holmes, and he is going to be in the rotation at defensive tackle. Their leader in interceptions last season, actually passes defended, was Maurice Norris, and Maurice Norris is not back with the program, but that secondary is still deep, returns a lot of good players. Carlton Johnson was first in interceptions last year with 4th. He doesn't return, but as I already have said, those are great players who left last year. A lot of the good players still return. So the defense, the offense, gives something to test Michigan a bit, I think, in Fresno State. But Michigan returns a plethora of talent defensively. That's why they're favored by 21 points, which if you took away Vegas's home field advantage number, and this was neutral field, Michigan would be favored by 18. They'd be favored by 15 points on the road. And this is over one of the better group of 5 teams. They did lose their head coach, Jeff Tedford, to health issues. Prayers to him, and hopefully he gets healthier. But this is still a very talented team. The question for Michigan is, how good will the quarterbacks play? Davis Warren had 5 passing attempts last year. He threw a pick, didn't complete any of his passes. He actually had a negative 40 passer rating last year. He's competing with Alex Orji, who threw no passes last year. But Orji, to his credit, ran for 86 yards and a touchdown, and is, I would say, just watching him and how he's played against, whether it's Ohio State or Alabama or some of these smaller schools in design run packages, he is a good scrambler. Those two are the quarterbacks for Michigan, and a winner of the competition hasn't been decided yet. I would say that Alex Orji is the front runner, but the competition is still pretty tight right now, and that leads me to believe that Michigan's quarterback room isn't great. Maybe it's good at best, or above average, could even be below average or bad. We'll have to see. But that's the big question mark, because, I mean, heck, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Davis Warren's transformed and Alex Orji's Lamar Jackson. Or maybe, Alex Orji's Tate Forcier and Davis Warren is Nick Sheridan. I mean, the range of outcomes are that big. We don't know what they are yet. And the truth is probably somewhere in the middle there. Michigan will probably have just an above average, maybe good quarterback room. And the starter won't be top 25, but probably will be top 50, top 40, maybe a little higher than there. That's the question. How do the QBs play? Especially with the fact that Michigan's returning leading wide receiver is Samaj Morgan with 204 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. Their leading receiver, not wide receiver, is tight end Colston Loveland, who had 649 receiving yards and 4 receiving touchdowns last year. Donovan Edwards also had 249 receiving yards last season. So how do these players, Tyler Morris, Samaj Morgan, Donovan Edwards, Colston Loveland, how do they perform in the passing game? And how does Davis Warren and or Alex Orji, if we see both of them or just one of them, perform in the passing game and even in their duties to escape the pocket, sense pressure, escape the pocket? How does Michigan's offensive line hold up against a Fresno State defense that was a respectable unit last season? Michigan defensively, I just think returns far too much talent to let Fresno State come in and win a game like this. So I have Michigan winning and covering 34-27, but I don't have Michigan winning by more than 30 points. And I think that's because, A, challenging opener, Michigan still is unsure a little bit about their identity on offense and at quarterback. I shouldn't have said identity on offense. They're still going to ground and pound. I think have one of the best rushing attacks in the country, but they're unsure about their passing game and their quarterback position especially. That's number one, the fact that they're facing a tough opponent with as much turnover as they have. That's the obvious. Number two is also pretty obvious once you peel over the first layer or two of the onion, is Texas is the following week. And I think Michigan is going to play this game ugly, a little bland, and try and save some things for Texas. And I expect the same thing, by the way, with Texas against Colorado State. I wouldn't touch that game or this game in terms of betting whatsoever. I just think that Michigan will win. They'll win 34-7, kick a few field goals, score some touchdowns with long drives, and just get on out of there after maybe being challenged for like the first half or maybe for the first quarter, or maybe they look ugly in all 4 quarters, but just look like the better team in all 4 quarters as well and win this game covering the spread. I'd believe Michigan just with what they bring back at running back and on the O-line, which doesn't look like much, but is more than people believe. And also defensively with Mason Graham returning. Mason Graham had 3 sacks last year. Kenneth Grant had 3.5. Josiah Stewart had 5.5. Derek Moore had 5. With them returning on the defensive line and also Will Johnson returning at corner, he had 4 interceptions and 4 passes defended. I do think Michigan wins this game handily, probably run for over, I would say 200 or at least 150 rushing yards. Pass, I would say for over 150 or over 200, and then the defense will put on a pretty constricting performance. Up next, I want to discuss, last but not least, Ohio State hosting Akron. The Ohio State Buckeyes open up the 2024 season taking on in-state opponent Akron, except this isn't like Ohio State playing 2021 Cincinnati, which 2021 Ohio State versus 2021 Cincinnati was, in my mind, a matchup that we deserved to see. A team that was all offense versus a team that was all defense, and they were in the same state, and both were some of the best teams in the country that year. This is Akron, which is why Ohio State is favored by 49 points at home. Ohio State last played Akron in 2021, a game in which Kyle McCord started as a true freshman, and Ohio State won 59-7, outscoring the Zips 59-0 after Akron took the lead in the first quarter with a touchdown. The Buckeyes, they bring back so much of their roster, 15 starters, more than 60% of their production. Their head coach in Ryan Day. They upgraded their staff by bringing in Chip Kelly. They used the transfer portal well to bring in Quinshon Judkins, to bring in Will Howard, Caleb Downs, Will Merrick, Will Howard. And look, there are reasons to pick them to win the national championship game. I'm not someone who's picking them to win the national championship game, but I'm telling you up front, this team is going to be very good. That's why they're favored by 50 points against a scrub like Akron. And for context, most teams, even if they are great, even if they're top 10, aren't favored to beat a team like Akron by 50 points. That's a pretty big spread, a humongous spread. And Ohio State is going to win this game no matter what. I don't even see an upset being possible here. Of course, in theory, it's possible, but I don't see it happening. So why am I doing a game preview here? Well, I'm doing a game preview here because Akron is a football team, and Ohio State has some things that they want to get better at compared to last year. Akron's quarterback is going to be Ben Finley. Ben Finley played at North Carolina State University. I think maybe a little bit last year, or I don't know if it was last year. No, it was 2022. He played at Cal in 2023, but he spent most of his career at NC State. Last season, he threw 3 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, only 572 yards, and he only ran for 8 total yards and less than a yard per carry. Frankly, not a very good quarterback. And one of the starting wide receivers, the starting running back, and different pieces on the offensive line and defense are incoming transfers. I mean, Akron last year only passed for just over 2,000 yards, and they didn't even run for 1,000 yards. They were just a horrific team. Joe Moorhead's a good coach. He may put together like a good drive against Ohio State, but Akron is just a tough place to win. Ohio State's roster is very much the superior one. Henderson ran for 926 yards last year and 11 touchdowns. Quinshon Judkins ran for over 10 touchdowns and 1,000 yards last season. And Ohio State returns 2022 1,000-yard receiver Emeka Egbuka. They bring back Carnell Tate and Brandon Innes, who were 5 stars out of high school. Jeremiah Smith is expected to be an All-American or close to All-American caliber player at wide receiver this year. They return 4 out of 5 of their offensive linemen. And they bring back a defense that only allowed 11.2 points per game last year. They bring back their leader in sacks, Jack Sawyer, who had 6.5. Their leader in interceptions of Jordan Hancock. And they bring back, tied for first, leader in passes defended in cornerback Denzel Burke, who also had a pick, a forced fumble, 24 total tackles. Ohio State's goal in this game, I think, is going to be running the ball and doing it consistently and having good offensive line play and also good running back play. I put up how do the running backs perform because that's the obvious question, is how does Henderson look after a year last year where he was great, elite by the end of the year, but he's a player who obviously needs space to hit his big plays and to be consistent. So does that change? Is he healthier, has more of a power element? Or if he doesn't appear to be that way, is that because his offensive line isn't good, or is that just because of who he is? And for Quinshon Judkins, can he get explosive plays? He's obviously going to pick up consistent yardage. He's more of the power back out of the two. But how does the offensive line and the running back room do here? And obviously Ohio State will run for more than 100 yards on these guys. I think that's obvious, even given some of their past struggles in the ground game. But what about more than that? Can they dominate on the ground? Can they ground and pound for an entire drive? I don't know if they'll do this because A, they probably want to play it a little bland until they meet up with Oregon or until they have to. And B, you don't want Henderson or Judkins to be injured. But with Henderson, Judkins, and Will Howard, I imagine that it'd be a very realistic goal to run for over 200 yards on this team. And I think with 4 to 5 offensive linemen returning, a good blocker at tight end, Will Kakmarek, I think that that's reasonable and very doable. Something else to pay attention to is how accurate is Will Howard, because his accuracy is not going to be affected by Akron's defense. That'll just be him standalone. How accurate does he look? And for the defense, can they pitch a shutout? I think they will pitch the shutout, but I don't know exactly if Ohio State's going to cover this spread or not, because when these spreads are huge, and especially with a team like Ohio State with the new clock rules, where Chip Kelly may want to run, by a ratio of 60 to 40 run versus pass, or in a game like this, maybe even more, Ohio State's going to control the clock. I think that they're going to want to stay healthy, bring in some backups, and I look at that 49-point spread. I don't think Akron's going to hold Ohio State to a field goal. So 49-0, all 49 of these points I think will be scored in the first three quarters. Most of them will probably be scored in the first half, and then Ohio State turns it down a notch. With the defense being better than the offense, the defense earns a shutout, but the offense doesn't score much after halftime. And you get that 49-0 win. This is a big year for Ohio State. I think they'll start it off right. I think in any season under a Ryan Day team, they would blow out a team like this Akron. But last year, against Western Kentucky, against Youngstown State, they did struggle early, and they just pulled away in the second half because they were that much more talented, and especially because of their defense and Marvin Harrison Jr. Well, there is no more Marvin Harrison Jr., and Ohio State wants to be a better team than they were last season. And I think that whether they're a better team than last year or not, I think they are. They will be better built to game control opponents to death. They will be better built to not have like the drive against Notre Dame to win. They won't need that type of drive. They're going to be a more physical team, and they're going to be more dynamic on the ground, and consequentially have at least a more balanced attack. We'll see if the offense with its ceiling is higher, because Marvin Harrison Jr. is an elite player, and McCord historically has been more accurate than Will Howard, and that's why I mentioned Howard's name here, is what's his completion percentage, and how many long, medium, short throws does he complete, does he attempt, and what's there with Ohio State's passing attack, with their offense in general. The defense, is going to be one of the nation's best, if not the best. So I have Ohio State winning 49-0, not covering the spread, not going under, just a simple push. I'd stay away from this line. Thank you all so much for watching this video, for this live show, for tuning in. I'm very happy with what we are doing here. 3 days in a row, 3 live streams in a row. I do have work tomorrow. I'm going to have to wake up very early, like in just under 9 hours. So I am going to get off. We don't have any super chats, so I'm not going to answer any questions tonight. But thank you all for coming on, and I will see you guys very soon. Have a great day, and good night.